Welcome to Sodbusters, Chapter 10, Part 2. Page 146. Please turn there now, and I will start reading. Thinking Big in Lincoln County. It was September 16th, 1879, and the people who had assembled at the village of Lake Benton in southern Lincoln County were talking excitedly among themselves. Many of them craned their necks to see what was happening less than a quarter mile to the east. The railroad was coming. About 200 men, track layers, bridge builders, surfacers, tie men, and pile driver operators were working quickly. They had gotten past the curved section of the road and were now working on the straightaway toward the village. By noon, the track reached Lake Benton and the first train had arrived. The crowd cheered. The people of Lincoln County had been waiting years for this day. Now boasted to the editor of Lake Benton Times, everything was going to change. A few weeks will make a marked change in the appearance of our village. Businessmen all have been waiting the completion of the road so they might obtain lumber at cheaper rates and get their goods transported at a less cost. As material can soon be obtained, buildings will doubtless commence at once, and Lake Benton will contain at least 75 buildings before the snow flies. The railroad connected Lincoln County to much of the rest of Minnesota and much of the rest of the United States. Everything seemed closer now. Before the train, a trip to Marshall, the nearest next big town, 16 miles away, took a full day. Now it just took a couple of hours. People could even travel to the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul in less than a day. Mail traveled between post offices faster than ever before. Until this time, county residents were mainly limited to trading with their neighbors. Now, with the arrival of the train, they could buy and sell goods from people far from home. The people of Lake Benton had become part of a larger market. This was especially good news for farmers like the Tainters. Now, instead of producing just enough to feed themselves and trading with neighbors, they had a good reason to produce more. All right, so let's look at the two sidelight pictures there. Looking up at the top, it looked like railroad companies issued tickets for trips, but they also gave out passes like these, which could be used over and over again during a one-year period. Also, look below at the picture. Building a railroad took large work crews to complete many different steps. How many construction jobs do you see being done on this railroad? Well, quite a few. I see guys laying stakes down. Probably some of those guys are going to lay iron. The train is following behind with stuff, so be interesting videos to watch laying railroad track. By the way, this is in 1879, and in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad connected both east and the west from Council Bluff, Iowa, or Omaha, Nebraska, all the way out to Sacramento, California. So now the railroad spanned the entire nation. Please take a look at the top of 147. Settlers who needed land to farm had several ways of getting it. The Homestead Act of 1862 provided one way. A homestead was a section of public land up to 160 acres if settlers claimed a section and lived on it for 5 years, built a house, and cultivated the soil. The government let them have that property for a registration fee of $14. But settlers also used several other methods to get the land they wanted. Some bought it directly from the railroads, some settled on public land without permission, and then bought it from the government at bargain prices. Still others took advantage of government programs that granted free land to soldiers. But not everyone who obtained land in these ways actually intended to live on it and farm it. Many people wanted the land so they could sell it to somebody else at a profit. These people were called land speculators. They often made a great deal of money by guessing which land settlers would want to buy. Consider the case of Louis Fertile, a speculator in Lincoln County. Records showed that Fertile once paid the government $8 for 160 acres. 10 days later, he sold the same 160 acres for $1,200. Not all speculators were lucky as Louis Fertile, though many lost their life savings by guessing wrong about the land's value. Also notice there's one of the key terms, land speculator, someone who buys lands and sells lands hoping to make a profit, often at great financial risk. If we want to get together in a group and talk about that, we can do that too. Now I'm going to continue with the reading. So we're going to go just below the yellow there. The more they grew, the more they could sell the land, sell it on the open market. They had sold. The more they sold, they believe, the better off they would be. So John and Sarah decided to buy more land for growing crops. The Tainters had claimed 80 acres under the Homestead Act. They knew the government would give them the land for $14 if they stayed there 5 years and improved it by plowing, planting, and building a house. But now they wanted to add another 40 acres that belonged not to the government, but Winona and St. Peter Railroad. The railroad had been given the land by the federal government and was eager to sell. That was how it raised the cash needed to build the rail lines. So railroads asked the government to give them land on either side of the rail track if they built rails across it. If they built the rails across it, they got the land on either side. They got quite a bit of land this way. Then they would turn around and sell it and make a profit off of that. So the more track they laid down, the more land they got, the more profit they had. Okay. In 1883, after several years of scrimping, John and Sarah bought an additional 40 acres for $160. The crops they grew on the new land would eventually earn enough to pay for a larger farmhouse elsewhere on their homestead. The Tainters were grateful to the railroad for selling them the land at what they felt was a good price. But would they remain grateful? Railroad, friend or foe? Lincoln County was not the only place in Minnesota that changed once the trains came. Railroads transformed the entire state, especially the western part. In 1860, Minnesota had no railroads. 20 years later, they had more than 3,000 miles of track that crisscrossed the state. Take a look at the picture on the bottom of 147. Arrival of a train in a small town was an important event, bringing new settlers, visitors, mail, news, and goods faster and more often than in the days before railroads. All right. So you can take a look at that map there and look at how the railroads expanded, and you can even see up to present-day boundaries of railroads. And actually, even in the more present-day, railroad property has shrank. I mean, even the rail lines, you'll notice up north especially, there's less rail lines because of roads. All right. In the years following the Civil War, railroad companies built thousands of miles of track in Minnesota. Tracks soon stretched from southern Minnesota and into the northern parts of the state. Continuing on page 148 on the bottom, during that same period, the state's population grew from 172,000 to 780,000. This was not a coincidence. The railroads played an active role in attracting immigrants and encouraging settlement. So if not for the railroads, it might have been hard to convince people to settle in places like Lincoln County. The land of western Minnesota was good for farming, but it wasn't very easy to reach. These were a few good rivers that people could handle boat traffic and even fewer roads. Western Minnesota needed railroads to attract settlers. The question is how to attract railroads. The federal government answer was to give the railroad company millions of acres of land in western Minnesota for free. The companies then sold the land and used that money to pay for the construction of their lines. Railroad land was popular among settlers. The closer they were to the rail lines, the easier it was to send their crops east and visit friends and relatives in nearby towns. This system worked well for the railroads too. Not only did they make money on the land sales, but they also made sure there would be new customers along the line. At first, almost everyone seemed happy with this arrangement, but then feelings began to change. The railroad started charging more for shipping and storing crops, pocketing up to one-third of the price that wheat farmers received for their grains. To make matters worse, some of the company's inspectors often cheated the farmers by telling their grain wasn't as much as it really was. The farmers did not like what was happening, but what could they do about it? Once again, the Grange played an important role. Although the Grange had started out as a social and educational organization, the dispute over railroad freights helped change it into a political organization as well. Grange members state began pressuring the state legislature and regulate railroads in the 1870s. The legislature passed a series of laws maximizing fares and rates and creating the office of Railroad Commissioner. These Granger laws signaled the beginning of railroad regulation in Minnesota. The vast sod-covered prairies of southwestern Minnesota were turning into fields of wheat and corn, oats, potatoes, and hay. Thousands of settlers were changing the land to fit their needs to their dreams. Towns and counties that hadn't even existed a few years ago were bursting with new buildings and businesses. Trains cut through the landscape, carrying freight, passengers, and to and from the growing cities in the east. Life was getting faster, even in rural Minnesota, and this was just the beginning. Now, please take a look at the top of page 149, James J. Hill, and we'll finish with that today. All of the people who ran railroads in Minnesota, none were more successful or powerful than James J. Hill. James J. Hill was a short, broad-shouldered man with a disability that he kept hidden from others. He was partially blind in one eye due to a boyhood bow and arrow accident. But more than anything else, Hill was a businessman with an immense drive to get things done. He was fierce and some said unfair competitor. People called him the Empire Builder, and the name fit. Hill had entered the railroad business in 1878 when he and some business partners completed a rail line between the Twin Cities and Winnipeg, Manitoba. During the 1880s, he improved the existing railroad, built more track, and named his new company the Great Northern Railway. Hill continued to expand his holdings and eventually became one of the country's most powerful business leaders. He owned coal mines, iron mines, water power facilities, and Great Lakes steamships. He collected fine art and additionally spent much time, effort promoting and developing agriculture in Minnesota and other regions. By his rail lines, Hill knew that most farmers depended on railroads to send their produce to market. The more they produced, the more money he made. And we'll call that at the end of page 149. So that'll be with our regular reading. This is Sodbusters, Chapter 10, Part 2. Thank you for listening.